In short, if you've ever spent a lot of time looking at 2 Thessalonians and chapter 2, I think, kind of start by introducing the concept of how you look at different Bible subjects, different Bible topics. And it's inherent within, I think, all of us, especially with preachers, there is a novelty. We study a book, and that book has not changed in 2,000 years. There is a finite number of chapters and verses to it. So to have something that's newer is sometimes a very enthralling thing. To have a take on Scripture that is new is sometimes, very exciting, and preachers look at that, and so they kind of seek after that. But there is another old principle that an older preacher taught me, and that is the path that's well traveled is traveled for a reason. So you've got a pathway through the woods. You could strike out on your own path, but the path that's well traveled is usually well traveled for a reason. Now, why is that? Because it's been well traveled, because why? No one else has figured out what? Any better way. So to that end, the interpretation that we're going to talk about today, and then if we have to finish it up next Sunday, is one that I'll admit is very, very old. There's nothing new or novel about this at all. In fact, if you went back through biblical literature, it wouldn't surprise me if you found this point of view 1,000 years ago. But the reason that I bring it up is because I think it's one of these instances where you have a well-traveled path, and it's well-traveled for a reason. It's because there have been lots of people who've looked at this for a long, long time, and they understand that this is what, in the end, fits the best. Because when we look in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, there's lots of pieces to this, if I may call it a prophecy. Just like Matthew chapter 24, there were lots and lots of pieces to it. And then putting together all of the pieces in an appropriate way boils down to just what we think about it. And there are a lot of points of view over what this means, and I'll go through them all. But understanding it in some respects, in the way that a lot of people have always historically understood it, is sometimes not a bad thing at all. So, we talked about 1 Thessalonians today. So someone tell me about the relationship between 1 and 2 Thessalonians, because they weren't written very far apart. We don't know exactly how far apart, but they weren't written very far apart, possibly even just a matter of months. So 1 Thessalonians ended with what famous subject? It gets us every time. What did it end? What famous subject did it end with? The return of the Lord. It's the one that gets us all the time. In fact, it's why in all of these lessons, by the time we finish, I think there's 13 passages that we've studied, and like the last 4 are going to deal with the end of time. Is there any coincidence in that? No, because why? Because we've still got the end of the world, and there's a lot of people who generate a lot of interest because of stuff in the end of the world. So 1 Thessalonians was a book that Paul in chapter 4 talks about it being the end of the world. Then you get to chapter 5, and chapter 5 is mainly just known for, with a lot of very random, unrelated, nevertheless very important exhortations. The Thessalonians felt that the end of the world was coming when? Apparently very quick. So he has to write 2 Thessalonians and tell them what? They don't know, and something else has to happen first. And that's the element that we're talking about this morning. The falling away, the apostasy. Now, with the Thessalonians, apparently it had become so acute, the problem had become so acute that, remember, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, what had they even started doing? That sitting and waiting. That is, not doing what? Not doing their work. And Paul had to address that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. And he was even so hard about it that he said, not doing your work is equal to walking disorderly. If someone doesn't correct their disorderly walk, then what are you to do to them? You're to withdraw from them. You're to no longer identify them as faithful. So just doing physical work was that important. But it boiled down to the elements around the end of the world. So we get to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and looking in verses 1 and 2, now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and the gathering together to Him, we ask you not to be what? Not to be soon shaken in your mind or troubled either by a spirit or by word or by letter, as it was from us, as though the day of Christ had what? Had come. So there was even some thought that they had taught that not only was it imminent, but perhaps maybe even it had come. There's some debate on that, but he begins in verse 3 to start to lay it all out. So let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worship, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all powers, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteousness, with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Okay, so the need for this letter was simple. They had thought that the coming of the Lord was either imminent, or that it had, even as Paul had indicated, maybe had even been convinced that it already had come. But what does he tell them? There's what? There's a great falling away. What is the other word that we use for it? Apostasy. Okay, apostasy. Well, what does apostasy mean? It basically means a what? It basically does mean a falling away. It means a moving away from a standard of truth. Now this, as we read through this section, this focuses on this character of a man of lawlessness. There's some versions that call him a man of what? Man of sin, or a man of lawlessness. So let's talk about some of the ideas of who people think this man of sin and man of lawlessness is. I'll talk about a couple of these and then state why I think it's something different, and then we'll get to the really big one, which honestly most people think it is today. A lot of people believe that it was the ancient Jewish state, or a lot of people believe that it was pagan Rome. So the ancient Jewish state or pagan Rome. Well, neither one of those. The issue with it being one of those two is that neither one of those were an apostasy from what? Because where's this great falling away coming from? It's coming from within the church, and that's why Paul is warning them, and that's why the warning is so relevant to the Christians. That's where it's coming from. But when you think about ancient Judaism or even pagan Rome, that didn't come from the church. It just never did. There's also people who just think that it was a principle or a force of evil, just an evil time. But again, that's rather vague. And as I read through the passage, actually vague stuff doesn't seem to strike you at all. In fact, it strikes you as being what? Kind of, sort of, pretty what? Pretty specific. Now, not maybe to the specific level that you would have liked to have been able to put together an immediate understanding of it, but there were several specific elements that are indeed mentioned. Okay, so now, what is the big one that everyone thinks that it is? The one that most people think that it is. And when I say most people, I mean most people most religious people. Okay, Barbara, so they think he is, in another word, the Antichrist. He is the Antichrist, this lawless one. And as you can see, the characteristics that are being given, it certainly sounds like the Antichrist. And the Antichrist, if you have a familiarity with premillennial doctrine, when will this Antichrist come to power? What is the general thought? And remember, when we talk about this premillennial doctrine, you may have known it a little bit differently, and that's perfectly okay, because there are different shades of the way that people believe that this unfolds in the future. Nevertheless, when do most people think that the Antichrist is going to be on the earth? During the tribulation. So in premillennial theory, Charles had mentioned it, what takes place first? The rapture. And then after the rapture is the tribulation. And then during that tribulation, that's when who arises? The Antichrist, this man of lawlessness. And this man of lawlessness on the face of the earth is going to produce all of these results that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 talks about. Also, other places in the Bible, specifically the book of Revelation, I believe it's chapter 13 where it speaks about. So they have this idea that the Antichrist is going to come, he's going to be active, he's going to do all of these things. Then eventually, if you think about more in premillennial thought, and this is a question with more than one correct answer, depending on how you take it. How long will the tribulation last? To some people, they believe the tribulation will last 7 years. Some people believe the tribulation will last half of that, 3.5 years. But no matter which period of time that you believe, at the end of it, then what will take place? The famous Revelation 19, Battle of Armageddon. Christ is victorious. And then, at that point, what takes place? The setting up. Some of you have already answered it. Now we're at this point. The setting up of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And then after that will be the day of judgment. There's a reason that we go through all of this. First of all, I want you to understand the timeline. But secondly, our final passage, whether it's next week or the week after, is going to be Revelation 20. Where literally Revelation 20 does mention what? The 1,000-year reign of Christ. So this is why we lay it out, because both of these texts kind of work in together with this view of the end of time. So most people think in the religious world, if you have friends that you're going to be at work with tomorrow, and they go to various other different churches in town, ask them if there's an opportunity, ask them who they think the man of lawlessness is. I bet you more times than not, you'll hear he's the Antichrist. And a lot of that is based off of what we're going to see next time as I think a great misapplication of the end of the book of Revelation, specifically Revelation chapter 20. Okay, so all of that now is done, and it leads us to the question of, well, if it's not all of this, then what actually is it? And before I actually say, or we actually start getting into it, I'm not really going to mention it as a specific person, because it doesn't seem like it's going to refer to a specific person. So if you're looking for one singular individual in your understanding, it doesn't work that way. But it does work more of a way of a system that would come to development not that long after the first century. A system of development that we still see today. And this kind of goes back to the idea of it being a very, very old point of view. And that is, in essence, the Catholic Church. So the man of lawlessness or the man of sin would be what? Or who? The Pope. Well, which one? How many have there been, by the way? How many have there been? They go all the way back. You know, the Catholic Church says that they trace them all the way back to where? To Peter. And if you look, there are places online that literally give every single one of them from Francis all the way back to Peter. So it's not like it's a mystery. If you want to know their names and when they were popes, there's no mystery to it. And there's quite a few of them. I've forgotten the exact number. I'm thinking around 100 or so that there have been over the last couple of thousand years, thereabouts. So it's the system, it's the idea of what would develop into the Pope. Was that the case in the first century? No. In fact, how long did it take for the Pope as such to become the Pope? How long did it take? 606. So remember what happened to the Catholic Church. What happened to it? Keith talked a lot about this last year in his meeting. What happened to the Catholic Church? It split into a Western and an Eastern. The Western was known as, think Western, the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern was known as the Greek Orthodox Church. And the Greek Orthodox Church, the Orthodox churches have split even more. There's lots and lots of different Orthodox churches. But in 588, one of the reasons why the Catholic Church divided is that more of the Eastern part, the Greek part, had a man, John the Faster, in 588, whom they wanted to appoint as the head Pope or Papa, the father of all of the church. Well, the people in the West fought against that, and the church divided. So in 606, the Roman Catholic Church set up the first Pope, and he became the universal figure of the Catholic Church. So when we go through 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, I'm not necessarily picking one church system over the other. It's not necessarily the Greek Orthodox because they actually had a Pope faster. It's not the Roman Catholic Church because that Pope is more popular. It's just the whole system, the whole division in which that took place, the whole development over centuries, where you now have this pretty predominant religious system. And how predominant is the Roman Catholic Church, by the way? Again, let's kind of think about it from numbers. How many people are on the planet? 8 billion people on the planet. How many are in Christianity as defined as Christianity? How many of them are in that? A little over 2 billion. A little over 2 billion. How many of those are Catholics? about half of those, which are around 1 billion. Now, if you look it up, if you're looking it up on your phone right now, it may say 1.2, 1.3 billion, something like that. It is a sizable number of people. It is not an insignificant number of people. And Paul was warning that this would be a what? In 2 Thessalonians, it would be a great apostasy. It would be a falling away. And so there's lots and lots of us. In fact, there's several people in the room who formerly used to be Catholics, who learning truth and learning what God wanted them to do, left that system behind because they understood it wasn't what the New Testament teaches. So I'm going to present this as the development of that system. Again, I ran through just a handful of them, but there's even more that are out there. But this one is one that is admittedly a very, very old way of looking at it. But as we go through it, I think in the end you're going to see it's probably the best way to look at it. So, kind of starting from the idea of what all takes place, let's just kind of look at this. So, identifying the man of lawlessness, at least kind of looking in the direction of what it's going to be. Some of these traits. Okay? So, one of these traits is that it's going to be a falling away, or there's going to be an apostasy. That is just essentially a defection from the faith. The New Testament warns about that. In fact, what did it say in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1? What did the Bible say in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1? It's wonderful. We try to bring people to the gospel, but as sure as we bring people to the gospel, well, what's going to happen? People are going to depart from it. They're going to leave it. So this man of sin was going to be kind of the head of this apostasy. As you're looking in 2 Timothy chapter 2, you'll also notice that the man of sin was yet to be what? Yet to be revealed. Now, if my understanding and the way that I'm presenting this is true and correct, what this means is, when Paul is writing it in the first century, it hadn't what? It hadn't happened yet. Now, there's going to be some seeds of it, and I'll bring that up in just a minute. But the apostasy itself hadn't happened, which is the whole point of the text. This hasn't happened, but as it does, then you start to realize what? The end of the world won't take place until after that. Remember, they thought it was going to be something imminent, so imminent they might as well stop working. Paul was saying it's something that's going to be long in development. And we've already brought up the fact that it's hundreds of years in development. The end won't come until after that. The man of sin, if you'll also notice, is also referred to in verse 3 and also in verses 6 and 7 and then in verse 8, but particularly in verse 3 as a son of what? A son of... The King James Version uses the word that's a bit more confusing just because it's an older word. But it's a son of what? Perdition. So, newer versions say what? Destruction. Why would he be a son of destruction? That's what because in people following this, what does it bring them? Destruction. Because why? Think about in verse 1. If they follow him, what have they done? They have fallen away. They have, what was our other word? Defected from the faith. So, again, it's actually a good point to bring up. It's not a nice point, it's a good point to bring up. That people have the capability to teach whatever they want. But that teaching has consequences. And I think this man of lawlessness, or this man of sin, who is also known as a son of perdition or destruction, shows that there's consequences to teaching and believing teaching and following teaching. So Paul warns of him as a son of destruction or perdition. In verse 8, what was he called? A lawless one. Okay, why was he a lawless one? Outside the law. Outside whose law? Outside of God's law, yes. Outside of God's law. So there are some characteristics now that's brought up. He opposes God, he exalts himself, and he sits in God's temple. So, in exalting himself and in sitting in God's temple, what do you think that means? He sets himself up in the place of God. So, if it brings up the idea of temple, there is an inclination to want to kind of go back to the idea of Judaism. But the word that's used with temple here in the New Testament is more of a New Testament word, naos. And that temple was known for the church. When we see the temple as it is mentioned in the New Testament, and it especially uses this word naos, the context normally defines it as being the church, unless, of course, you're looking at something, say, in the Gospels. So he sits in God's temple. So where is he? He is in what? The church. Or as the church is falling away or defecting, that's kind of where it begins. Opposes God. Opposes God. If he's sitting in the temple of God, the aura would be that he's what? He's from God, he's serving God, but in actuality, Paul says he is going to oppose God and then exalt himself. What did Jesus say about leadership in the New Testament? What did Jesus say about leadership? The one who wants to be first must become last, and yes, exactly. And he must become a servant of all. So the Lord never put the hierarchy of leadership in the New Testament where there would be someone who would ascend all the way to the top. So Paul would warn he would exalt himself. Now another one, and I want to definitely cover this, so we'll have to finish this next week, but that's okay, and then we'll go right into Revelation 20. But the man of sin deceives with what? We read through it, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the man of sin deceives with what? With what was it? Signs, wonders, and lying miracles. Signs, wonders, and lying miracles. Let's see, that was in verse 9. Well, the New King James Version, power, signs, and lying wonders. So, normally if we would bring up the concept of miracles today, and in no way being in no way trying to be insulting, if you were thinking about miracles today, who would you bring up? What would you bring up? What religious group would you bring up? Pentecostals. How long has Pentecostalism been around? (1901). That's exactly right, 1901. So let me say this, and again, not in an insulting way. Pentecostalism has nothing on the Catholic Church. Absolutely nothing. I don't suppose there's ever been a group on the face of the earth that has claimed to work more miracles than the Catholic Church. And let me give you an insight into it. So what do the Catholic Church have? Yes, they have the Pope and they have the cardinals and they have the bishops and they have the priests. But what else do they have? They have saints. How many saints are there? Does anyone know? It's actually not numbered, because they'll say that there have been records that have been lost to history, which I actually don't doubt. But there is an approximate number that's put on it, and it's 10,000. It's 10,000. One of the qualifications, do you know what one of the qualifications of a saint is? They had to work miracles. And I don't know why there are people who are Catholic who could, members of the church who are Catholic who could explain this better for me. I'll admit ignorance here. But for some, the threshold was 4 miracles. For others, the threshold was 6. I don't know why there's different thresholds, and maybe there aren't. Maybe I'm mistaken in the information that I have perfectly, that I'm perfectly capable of doing that. But every single saint had to have verified miracles. That's why the process of, what's it called when someone becomes a saint? Do you know what the process is called? Canonization. And that's why lots of times the process of canonization takes how long? Centuries. Because they have to verify what? That they had miracles, or that they performed miracles. Well, guys, here's the moment of truth. We've had 10,000 people who, from the time of Jesus Christ, 10,000 people who have claimed to work multiple miracles apiece. It's the moment of truth. What are you going to say about that? What are you going to say about that? They are powers, signs, and what? And lying wonders. Now, is that beyond the pale of what we see in of what we see in the Bible? Think about Moses. What happened with Moses? God told him to go do what? You go talk to Pharaoh and you tell him what? Let my people go. And God, this was the first time God gave the ability to work miracles to any human being on earth. What does Moses go and do? Works miracles right off the bat. What the magicians of Pharaoh do? Copied them. But what were they? They were lying wonders. They looked what? They looked really, really good. They looked real. And I've mentioned before, and it still is astounding to me, those guys on TV who take a deck of cards and they throw it through a plate glass window. Guys, the card sticks on the outside of the window. How do they do that? I know it's not real, but man, does it look, it's like the coolest looking thing in the world. But it's a simple trick. That's the thing about learning about that stuff on YouTube, is that once someone tells you how to do it, it's so deflating because it's always so easy. Because in a split second, it's got to work, or else you're going to what? You're going to figure it out. I don't want people to be uncomfortable, but it's lying wonders. It just unfortunately is. Just like we've got lying wonders today, they are what they are, and this would be characteristic of this movement and this development. Okay, we'll keep going through the last few elements of what Paul mentions, bring it to a close, and probably move on into Revelation 20 next time.